Hello MEUS 1002 students! In this video, we are going to briefly take a tour of physical media formats for audio recording throughout history. So, let's begin with the earliest examples. A lot of music goes back thousands and thousands of years, pretty much since humans have evolved, and even before, there is evidence that Neanderthals actually played music. But it wasn't until humans had evolved writing systems that they began to notate music down. However, before the invention of the phonograph in 1876, there was no way to hear music. You could transmit it orally. You could teach a person to play a piece based on how you played it. Or you could write it down in notation, but you couldn't play back a sound file or a recording of audio. The earliest examples of notation that we have go back a ways, 1400 BCE in fact. We've got examples from ancient Babylonians, the Huronian hymns, which use cuneiform instructions for how to perform the piece by telling the performers first the scale used and which string on a lyre each note corresponds to, as well as giving pitch information for individual syllables in the lyrics. This is really similar to the Cyclos epitaph from ancient Greece, which is approximately from the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. However, no complete compositions exist before the Byzantine Empire, approximately 600 CE. Musical notation has evolved over time. Again, the ancient Babylonians and Greek pieces used text instructions in order to indicate pitch, but rhythm was generally based on the poetic meter of the lyrics and somewhat up to the performer. There are some basic rhythmic notation schemes that would evolve in the form of placing dots over the pitch to indicate stresses or longer notes. In fact, most Western musical notation is based on the church, whether that is Catholic or Eastern Orthodox nowadays, and their music. In fact, before the big split between those two denominations, it was all one big church, and they had more or less the same type of notation. It started with what was called neumes, which were shorthand indications of pitch contour. So you would have little notes going up or down as kind of curly cues over the lyrics that showed when to sing higher or lower, which was great as shorthand if you already knew the tune. But it didn't give definite indications of pitch, and it definitely did not talk about rhythm. Because of that deficiency, neumes evolved into square notation, which uses a 4-line staff with square note heads that gives you a definite pitch for everything, but still lacks a good definition of rhythm. That finally evolved into standard notation on the 5-line staff around 1350 is more or less when it's standardized. And this is the standard that we still use today. So here's an example of standard notation. This is a piece for guitar quartet. You have the 5-line staff, treble clef, and you have different notes at different lines or spaces indicating pitch, and different lengths of notes are indicated by the number of beams that are attached to them if they have a dot after them. There's articulations in the form of tenuto marks and slurs as well. But all of these notational systems, and more like tablature, suffer from one major problem, which is that notated music requires a performer to perform it so that someone else can hear it. This led to attempts to record sound, but they all suffered from the same problem. They could record it in different ways, but they couldn't reproduce it. Probably the most important of these examples is Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, who created the phonautograph in 1857. It could detect sound in the form of vibrations going into a horn that channeled the vibrations to a diaphragm made out of glass and a stylus that would inscribe the results on paper. It was a very cool device, but it couldn't play the sounds back, which made it a curiosity. But a group called First Sounds was able to resurrect and play some of those original recordings in 2008. And in the text, I have a link to some of their examples. It's very cool to play around with and listen to. And here is a picture of the phonautograph. So if the phonautograph didn't actually do anything in terms of playing back sound, it had a profound influence on the phonograph, which was developed slightly later in 1876 by Thomas Edison, and is the first device that could record and play back sound. At first it did this by taking cardboard tubes wrapped in tinfoil and cutting grooves into the foil. Then it moved on to wax, as tinfoil is not the most sturdy of materials. But this can be seen as a direct evolution of the phonautograph. It worked in exactly the same way, but instead of writing on paper, it cut a groove, gradually spiraling from one end to the other of the cylinder. And this was operated by a hand crank. Then you could reset the position of the horn, switch out the stylus from a record stylus to a playback stylus, and then actually play it back by cranking it. And you would hear the grooves corresponding to changes in amplitude and thus creating sound. Again, though, tinfoil was way too fragile, so this was replaced first with brown wax, which was better but would decay and become unplayable after maybe 20 plays. So different formulas of wax were tried, which led to a longer 4-minute playtime with changes to the technology of the phonograph itself, and was more or less standardized with the blue amberol cylinder in 1908. So these wax cylinders and the phonograph were the dominant media format from the 1880s until about 1929. Pretty good lifespan. But they also had a sort of afterlife, being used in dictation machines until as late as 1947, although there were probably a couple that were still in use after that. Here is an example of an early wax cylinder player and a blue amberol cylinder. Roughly around the same time, in 1887, Emil Berliner created the gramophone. This is the first disc-based media player. Please be aware that the term record player and gramophone are essentially the same thing. They're synonyms. However, the term record player is common in the US, while gramophone is used in the UK in particular and throughout Europe. Aside from the changes to discs instead of cylinders, the gramophone worked very similar to phonographs. You would channel vibrations through a horn onto a glass diaphragm with a stylus attached, and that would cut grooves into a disc that could then be played back. Early discs were first coated with ink or paint, and then you would cut the grooves into those. But then they got the idea to use zinc discs coated with wax. You would cut the grooves into the wax, then bathe the disc in acid. Anywhere that the wax had been removed, it would permanently etch the groove into the zinc disc, creating a permanent master disc that you could use to make duplicates for commercial release. The early recordings were not great, but this was the path to greatness, effectively. Refinements to the gramophone resulted in first the 10-inch disc in 1901, the 12-inch, and a standardized speed of 78 revolutions per minute in 1912, then the 12-inch 33 1/3 RPM disc in 1931, which was initially a flop for RCA Victor, mostly owing to the time period. This was at the end of the Great Depression, which started in 1929 and continued throughout the early part of the 1930s. But it proved to be much more successful for Columbia Records when they reintroduced the format in 1948. The 12-inch 33 1/3 disc became the standard in the early 50s and led to the introduction of first stereo albums, where you would have sound coming from the left and the right in 1957, and then quadraphonic albums, where you would have front left, front right, back left, and back right channels in 1971. Material refinements were roughly parallel to these technological developments. After the initial experiments with paint and zinc, records were made out of glass, hard rubber, and shellac from 1895 until the end of World War II, and in some applications as late as until the 1960s. Vinyl records were introduced by RCA in 1931 for movie playback systems, then later as a deluxe special edition after World War II, becoming the standard around 1948 with the 12-inch 33 1/3 disc offering 23 minutes of recording time on each side. Here's a picture of an old hand crank style gramophone on the left, and then on the right is a standard 12-inch record. You can see the grooves cut into it if you look closely. However, there were other experiments at the same time. The wire recorder was first developed as the telegraphone in 1898 by Vladimir Poulsen. This used a very, very thin steel wire that it magnetized by pulling it across a recording head. This would create variable changes in magnetic intensity and polarity that corresponded to the electrical signal coming from a microphone. This could then be played by passing the wire over a playback head that would pick up the changes in magnetic intensity and reproduce these as changes in electrical current and use that change in current to drive a speaker, creating sound. The wire recorder was mostly used as a dictation device in businesses. And a large reason for this was the simple fact that the wires are incredibly thin, incredibly fragile, and very prone to breakage. As a result, it was not commonly used in radio studios or for creating music, with the notable exception of Egyptian composer Halim al-Dab, who created two pieces, The Expression of Zahar and Wire Recorder Piece, both in 1944. These are considered to be classics of electronic and experimental music. They are absolutely incredible. I strongly recommend listening to them. And here is a picture of the wire recorder. You would place a wire spool on one spool, and then it would go over the playhead to the other, and then you could play it back. This, however, did have an effect in that the wire recorder directly influenced the development of magnetic reel-to-reel tape. This was influenced by the wire recorder, and specifically by Kurt Steele, whose improvements and patenting work kept the telegraphone alive through the 1920s and slowly transitioned from wire to much more robust steel tapes beginning in 1924. Steele's work was further refined by Fritz Plummer, who created the first modern tapes as we know them in 1928. These being strips of paper or celluloid coated in magnetic powder of various chemical compositions. Now, here's the part that that always is a little troubling. There is a very large connection to Nazi Germany with the reel-to-reel tape. Further refinements on tape occurred primarily in Germany during the lead-up to World War II, with work from chemical company IG Farben, electronics manufacturer AEG, and German State Radio. This resulted in the AEG magnetophone K1 in 1935, which was designed to preserve the words of Nazi officials for posterity. Not a great start to that piece of technology. Further, during World War II, the use of magnetic tape by the Nazis was a bit of a puzzle to the Allies who were monitoring radio broadcasts. The reason for this was that the Nazis would make multiple copies of a recording, Then they would have different radio stations broadcast them simultaneously from different locations with essentially perfect audio quality. So the Allies were stumped. They were trying to figure out, where is this Nazi official broadcasting so that I can bomb them or otherwise send soldiers out after them and arrest them. And they couldn't figure it out because they were coming seemingly from 5 or 6 different cities that were in completely opposite ends of Germany or other occupied territories simultaneously. And it was a major puzzle until the end of the war with the invasion of Axis territories, when magnetophones began to be captured by the Allied forces. And they were able to figure out, hey, they've got this new recording technology. It sounds really good. And you can make near perfect duplicates and play them simultaneously in different areas. So post-World War II, there was a lot of interest in the tape recorder. Very, very significant amounts of research and development occurred. Partly because, as part of Germany's reparations for World War II, the U.S. seized all patents to the magnetophone, leading many companies in the U.S. to build their own. And famously, this included the legendary Ampex Corporation, who were financed by the singer Bing Crosby for $50,000 out of his own pocket, which is approximately $764,000 and change as of 2022. He did this because he had a very popular radio show that he had to do twice. He would do one broadcast for the East Coast market, then he would do a second broadcast for the West Coast market. And that was very, very tiring for him, obviously. So he wanted to be able to do one show, record it live for the East Coast, and then play it back for the West Coast audience. And Ampex made it happen. And in fact, Crosby debuted this on October 1st, 1947, and it became his method of working for the rest of his life. Advances to the tape chemical formula quickly came in 1948 from 3M, and technical innovations led to the ability to record not just 1, but 2, then 4, then 8 tracks on tape by the mid-1950s. Only 7-8 years. This let engineers edit recordings for the first time, actually taking a razor blade and cutting sections out of a tape, then, well, taping the ends of 2 tapes together. This edit ability made reel-to-reel tape the standard recording format until people switched over to digital recording and fully digital editing in the mid to late 90s. And here is a picture of a standard reel-to-reel tape. If you've listened to any music that was commercially recorded and put out before about 2000, chances are it was recorded on one of these originally. They may have done edits in a digital audio editor like Pro Tools, but the masters were generally first done to tape. So reel-to-reel tape was super common in studios, but there's a problem. It's bulky, it's difficult to use, and many consumers didn't really like it and preferred records. Even though it was easier to reproduce, it was a lot more convenient. As a result, a number of companies attempted to create successors for reel-to-reel tape for the consumer market, which resulted in 2 major developments. The first was the compact cassette, or tape cassette, in 1963, and this was quickly followed by the 8-track in 1964. So the 8-track has a very impressive pedigree. It was created as a collaboration between Learjet, the aviation company, Ampex, the reel-to-reel tape maker, Ford Motors, General Motors, Motorola, and RCA Victor. These are some of the biggest companies in America in the 1960s. And on paper, this should have been a smash hit. It housed an endless loop of tape on a spool inside of a cartridge with little pieces of metal foil between the tape to create separate tracks so that a user could easily skip between tracks. It had a massive group of well-known companies backing it, Lear and Ford and GM, so that they could put it in their vehicles. Ampex because they were the tape experts, Motorola and Victor because they were the hardware experts. It was natively stereo. And then in 1970, they released a quadraphonic version, which is actually still very collectible to this day. It was a luxury upgrade for Ford cars starting in 1966, which was the exact same year that home 8-track decks came out, making it possible for you to take your music on a cartridge directly out of your home stereo and then put it into your car stereo and just keep on going. But it was a failure for two big reasons. The largest one, it was literally 3 times the size of the compact cassette. Then a smaller but nonetheless very important one, it was a playback-only format. You couldn't just go out and buy blank 8 tracks and record to them. However, that was not the case with the compact cassette. So the compact cassette was introduced by the Philips Corporation in 1964, and initially it should have been destroyed by 8-track because the audio quality was terrible. And in blind tests, everybody who tried it preferred the sound of the 8-track. But this was quickly fixed and the quality improved so that by 1970 it was on par or above the quality of 8-track sound, especially with the introduction of Dolby Type B sound and a switch to chromium 4 oxide tape, which generally reduced noise and hiss. But it had a secret weapon. It was extremely easy to record to compact cassettes for home users. Most commercial tape decks, even those that were sold up through the end of the 90s, had the ability to record directly from one tape to another in the same unit. This led to the rise of the mixtape, where you would record different songs onto a compilation tape that you could give to a person to tell them how you feel about them, or just to have your favorite songs all on one cassette that you could take into your car. Radio stations also got in on the craze of home recording by doing what was called album-oriented shows, where a station would take a brand new album from hit group number 5 or 6 or whatever and play it in its entirety, one side of the record. Then they would stop for commercials so that people could switch their tapes out, and then they would play the other side. Naturally, the recording industry was not happy with this, and there were lots of warnings that home taping was killing music, and you're hurting artists, and all sorts of similar things, and this is piracy, bad. And naturally, no one else agreed with their assessment. Compact cassette technology kept improving as well. And eventually, it allowed for up to 30 minutes of music that you could hear and record on each side of tape in full stereo. But then in 1979, Sony created the Walkman. And it became the first truly must-have tape player device, because you could take your music anywhere. It was in a handheld player. You could clip it onto your belt. It had headphones. It was the must-have device. And they became completely ubiquitous. By the 1980s, tape decks were everywhere. Homes, Walkmans, cars. In fact, early computers like the Commodore 64 in the US, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum in the UK and Europe, used tapes to distribute software before the rise of the floppy disk. It was absolutely impossible to avoid audio tape because they were the dominant form of recording for home users and purchasing and consuming music until the mid-1990s. But there was a problem with this format. Tape cassettes generally suffer from a certain amount of high-frequency hiss. You can hear it in the background. It's not noticeable to a lot of people, but it is to recording engineers and to audiophiles. This meant that there was a demand for a better audio standard, and the companies that were producing different media were quick to pick up on this. But here's a picture of how an 8-track works on the left and a compact cassette on the right. So, to make a new audiophile media standard, Sony and Philips combined forces to work on the next big format starting in the late 70s. This resulted in the compact disc or CD, which was first released in 1982. CDs are 120 millimeter diameter discs made out of plastic with a single reflective layer, typically of very thin aluminum foil, just under the top plastic layer and label that makes them reflective. They store digital data in the form of small pits that are inscribed into the bottom layer of plastic and are read by a laser shining through and hitting the reflective layer. This data is a measure of instantaneous amplitude or volume of the left and right channel of a stereo recording, recorded at what's called the Red Book or Sony Red Book standard of 44.1 kilohertz for the sample rate and 16-bit depth. This means that it can reproduce every single frequency the human ear can perceive, plus a couple others, and a dynamic range of 96 decibels from the loudest to quietest songs for a full 74 minutes. And there is a interesting but probably apocryphal story that the reason why it's 74 minutes is because that is the length of the New York Philharmonic Leonard Bernstein recording of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which supposedly is the favorite piece of the then current chairman of Sony, who wanted to be able to have the entire Beethoven 9 on one single piece of media without having to flip it over like cassettes or change out records. Whether that's true or not, no one really knows. It's probably untrue. Consumer adoption of CDs was not very fast. Don't get me wrong, they did sound better than records or cassette tapes, but they cost more, significantly more, especially when they were first introduced, and they could not be used as recording media. As a result, many people stuck with cassette tapes until the early 90s when Sony introduced the first CD-based Walkman. At that point, more people started to transition to CDs. And then having car CD players definitely helped as well. But it was really the mid-1990s when computers first started to become available with the ability to write to CDRs or CD recordables that people really transitioned. This let users make a mixed CD of files similar to a mixed tape using existing CDs or this newfangled MP3 digital audio format that was starting to become popular around 1996, 1997. This was then followed by the CD-RW or CD rewritable format, which was very similar to a CD recordable, but could be erased and rewritten one time. Combined with the growth of the internet and the ability to download MP3s and burn them to a disk, CDRs and CD-RWs fueled a wave of purchases. And in fact, CDs of all types are still available for sale to this day. And here is a picture of a CD. This is not labeled. In fact, it appears to be a Goldmaster disc. I still have a couple of these blanks that I use for recording projects every once in a while. But if CDs were going to be a replacement for records, digital audio tape, or DAT was intended as a replacement for the tape cassette. DAT was created by Sony and introduced in 1987, and it looks like a smaller tape cassette. But unlike a tape cassette, it's fully digital, it is always stereo, never mono, and you can record at sample rates of 32, 44.1, or 48 kilohertz, which is below, at the same level, or above CD quality levels at 16-bit depth. However, even though this makes you able to record a perfect copy of any analog or digital file, that led to a lot of lobbying by the Recording Industry Association of America because they were opposed to that. They had felt very, very burned by the sale of tape cassettes and did not want a perfect digital copy format to become available to consumers. And this absolutely had an effect on the consumer market. There's a lot of lobbying, there's a lot of lawsuits. It's a fascinating history you can look up later, and I do recommend it. But the end result was that DAT never took off with consumers, unfortunately. It did take off with the pros, though. In fact, DAT quickly found its way into studios, becoming the preferred format for master recordings. You would take your collection of reel-to-reel tape, send it to a DAT, and then you would have one nice, small, perfect master copy that could be used endlessly to duplicate any number of CDs, cassettes. It could be cut into vinyl records. It was perfect as a mastering format. Also, with the development of fully digital mixers in the early 1990s, it was possible for the first time to work entirely digital. From the time the signal from the microphone hit the digital preamp and converters until the signal was played by the consumer on their CD player. The result was massively cleaner sounding audio with way more options for digital manipulation and editing by the recording, mixing, and mastering engineers. And in fact, DAT was also a favored media choice for journalists and for sound recording for films and recording sound effects or for experimental sound design. Because it was so small, it was very portable. There were many, many handheld DAT recorders that were available from major manufacturers like Sony, Tascam, and Marantz. But ultimately, DAT fell to another Sony product, the mini disc, with the last DAT devices being released in 2005 and the last tapes being sold in 2015. There's a picture of the DAT. I actually remember these from recording in high school, and we would record directly to these, and they sounded so much better than tape cassettes. You can't even begin to describe how much of an improvement they were. Although they were quite finicky and the players were somewhat prone to breaking down, even the super expensive ones. Mini discs were released by Sony in 1992, and as I've stated, they eventually supplanted DAT as a favored recording format for a lot of people. They look a little bit like smaller versions of 3.5-inch floppy disks, but the discs themselves are permanently housed in a 68 by 72 by 5 millimeter cartridge with a little sliding door that allows access to the disc. So you're thinking they're probably very similar to CDs, just smaller and in a nice, cool little case. But unlike CDs, mini discs are magneto-optical discs, which is a really cool format that never really caught on too much anywhere, sadly. The way that magneto-optical discs work is that they use a laser to heat the disc on one side to what's called the Curie point, which is the temperature at which a material loses its inherent magnetic properties. Then, a magnetic record head writes digital data to the disc. As soon as you stop heating it, it's safe. Playback is then done with a laser exactly similar to a CD. But because of how this works, mini discs and other magneto-optical discs are nearly infinitely rewritable. You can keep using the same one over and over, just reheat it, go to town. And blank discs came in 60, 74, and 80-minute formats, which can offer even longer times if you use different data compression schemes. So by default, they first came out with a compression scheme called Adaptive Transform Acoustic Coding, or ATRAC, which compressed data onto the smaller disk. The initial version was based on what's called psychoacoustic lossy compression, which is just a fancy way of saying it removes sounds that most people wouldn't hear, similar to the MP3, but slightly better quality. But this went through revisions that resulted in better quality, with the ATRAC 3 version also coming out with the MDLP, or mini disc long play standard, allowing for longer recording times at lesser audio quality. Then the final revision, High MD, allowed for uncompressed CD quality sound on mini discs. All versions included anti-skip buffers, which were incredibly cool. It would store anywhere from 6 to 10 seconds of audio, and if you hit the player, jostled it, dropped it, bumped it, it had that stored in a temporary memory buffer so you wouldn't interrupt recording or playback. On top of that, because this is all digital, you could encode all sorts of other information, like the artist, the album, and track data. You could create markers to jump to favorite spots in a recording so that you could practice it if you were using it as a practice aid. So why haven't you heard about this format before, most likely? Well, mini discs were extremely popular in Japan and Europe, but they weren't a popular format among US consumers because you had to buy new hardware and because there were not a lot of pre-recorded albums that were ever really released. But they were extremely popular among musicians, journalists, radio stations, and concert bootleggers. Your average mini disc recorder is about the size of an iPhone. So that small size, ease of use, and the fact that they made fully digital recordings made them extremely popular with bands who would use them to record demos, practice sessions, or recitals. Journalists loved how small they were and that you could just hook up a microphone to them and start working with whoever you were interviewing. And radio stations loved how easy it was to edit interviews, create programs, queue up tracks or promos, all on one little disc. They were also incredibly popular with bootleggers because you could easily smuggle them into concerts. Very easily, in fact. So mini discs were officially discontinued by Sony in 2013. And the final recorders produced by TIAC and Tascam were discontinued in 2020, which gave them a 21-year lifespan from Sony, 28 years with the extended support from TIAC and Tascam as they sold off their remaining inventory. They may not have been a commercial success, but a lot of bands got their start recording demos to minidisc and then transferring them to CDs. Most famously including Radiohead, who released a 16-hour album of rare materials and demos called Minidiscs Hacked in 2019, not 9, which had tons of their initial minidisc sessions. And here is a picture of the minidisc. These things were so cool when they first came out. And to this day, I still have a certain fondness for them because that is how I got my start recording after the DAT tapes.